Want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank the agents for inviting me. Um, I do have my Facebook page for my program over here listed on that first slide if you're interested in more of what's going on over this way in Eastern Kentucky. I try to post things that are of current interest on there and links to various programs and things that I think people might be interested in. As they said, we're going to really dial this into early season apple care. For those of you that are growing apples, hopefully this is just a reminder of the things that you already have done. For those of you that are thinking about growing apples next year, this will give you some things to think about for next year as well. Apple trees, I should point out, are relatively easy to grow, but producing good quality fruit requires effort, including pruning and spraying. So if you're not committed to pruning and spraying and doing what needs to be done for producing good quality fruit, you can certainly grow apple trees, but the quality of apples that you'll be producing on your trees will not be what you expect relative to what you see in the markets and things. Just as a reminder, apple trees do not come true to variety from seed. So if you take the seeds out of a golden delicious or a red delicious and plant it, it's not going to come up as a golden delicious or a red delicious. So our apple trees are grafted. We choose a variety that we're interested in, and then we graft it onto a rootstock. The rootstock selection is very important because that can provide some resistance to various diseases that I'll be talking about. It also helps to control the size of the trees and things. Years ago, everybody grew apples on seedling rootstock, which produced a huge tree. Most people don't have space for those anymore, not to mention the fact that it's extremely difficult to spray a full-size tree anymore. Smaller trees are more suited for the homeowner, the backyard grower and things. So that's really what we encourage people to do. Apple trees also do require cross-pollination for fruit set. So one apple tree, unless it is grafted with multiple varieties, and those do exist, will not be sufficient unless there are other apple trees in the area that can provide cross-pollination. It doesn't have to be an eating apple. Many of our crab apple varieties are also good pollinators as well. I'll have a slide here in a moment for you that will illustrate pollination charts and things so that you get an idea of what to look at. Just as a rule of thumb, Jonathan is a very good pollinator, so keep that in mind. The trees do need to be blooming at the same time in order to get pollen transfer from the male to the female bloom as well. However, apples in general require similar conditions to other horticultural crops that most of you will be growing. They require a slightly acid pH in the range of 6 to 7. They're fairly tolerant of a little bit wider range, but ideally that 6 to 7 slightly acid pH is kind of what we're looking for. Fertility, most of our soils here in Kentucky have adequate fertility, especially if you're going to be growing these in the backyard. When you fertilize your lawn, the trees are getting plenty of fertilizer. You might want to think about dialing that back a little bit, particularly on the nitrogen. People like to put a significant amount of nitrogen on their lawns to get them nice and green and growing well. We like to dial back the amount of nitrogen on our apple trees just because that luxurious succulent new growth is very prone to fire blight, a serious disease in apples. Most of our soils have adequate amounts of phosphorus and potassium in there. So in general, just a light application of nitrogen is all your apple trees are going to require every year. Light is important, good airflow, good water drainage. Apples don't like to have standing water around their roots and things. So if you do need to improve your soil conditions ahead of time prior to planting, go ahead and do that, because once these trees get established, it's very difficult to really change the drainage patterns short of doing some tiling outside the drip line of the tree and things, which is a lot of work and things. Airflow is also important. What we found over the last few decades here in Kentucky and across the eastern US is that our trees are deacclimating their winter hardiness earlier and earlier. Our frost-free date in the spring hasn't changed here in Eastern Kentucky. Our frost-free date typically in quicksand where I'm based is somewhere between the 10th and 15th of May. And in fact, next week, we're forecasting some potentially frost in some of our low-lying areas and things over here. So even though our apple trees are in full bloom already over here, they deacclimated early. They had all their chilling hours they needed by first of the year or so, early January. And then as things have started warming up earlier and earlier, they begin their growth sooner. So anything that provides good air drainage to keep that cold air from settling around your trees is important. Don't plant your apple trees in low-lying areas where, remember, cold air is heavier, so it'll settle in the low-lying areas. If you plant on a hillside like we have in Eastern Kentucky, if there's anything blocking that air drainage off the hillside, it will pool around your tree. So good airflow is important as well. Not to mention later in the season, it also helps to cut down on disease conditions and things as well. Because when we talk about disease, we have what's called the disease triangle. You have to have a susceptible host, which in this case is apple trees. You have to have the pathogen, which would be a fungus or a bacteria in some cases, present, and you also have to have the appropriate environmental conditions. This being Kentucky, we usually have plenty of humidity. Our temperatures are adequate because some fungi will do well in cool conditions, some will do well in warm conditions. So we have all the conditions we need for that disease triangle for diseases to develop. This is just an example of a bloom chart. Check with your nursery to make sure your bloom times are compatible. If you don't know, there are over 2,000 varieties of apples out there in the world. Typically here in the US, there's somewhere around 200 or so varieties that are grown commercially in various quantities and things. So there aren't any charts out there that I'm aware of that even have all the commercial varieties in the United States on them. But if you go online or if you talk to your nursery, they can tell you what trees typically will bloom, especially the larger nurseries that you might be buying from Stark Brothers or Rain Tree Nurseries or some of the other larger nurseries. You can always check with your county agent as well, and they can help you check to make sure that these are compatible trees. We have a wonderful extension system here, one of the tops in the nation. You have some excellent agents there that you can contact for more information as well. But as long as the apple trees are blooming in the same period of time, they generally should be compatible. Occasionally there is some incompatibility between the apples, however, and that's what you'll see on a pollination chart as well. Now, this is a lot of information on this chart. I just put it in here so that you could get an idea of what information is out there on a pollination chart. Again, I don't know of any single chart that exists anywhere that has all this information. Adams County Nursery used to have a very large chart, much larger than this, that used to have all the varieties on it, but that's no longer available on their website as well. But typically, you'll look for the cultivar being pollinated on one side and the tree providing the pollen on the top of the chart, and then you just follow it down. And if the circle is, or the square is blacked in, it means that it's incompatible. So where you have the same varieties as you chase along the diagonal on that chart, you can see that the apples can't pollinate themselves because they're self-incompatible. There are some things that just aren't good pollinators. There are some things like Jonathan that's a pretty good pollinator for a lot of things as well. So you can follow these charts and things and see, just see what works for you. Again, the pollen has to be compatible. And as I said, a lot of our crab apples are pretty good pollinators as well. And I did mention these multiple variety trees. You can go to some of the commercial nurseries like Stark Brothers, and they'll have like 5 varieties or 4 varieties grafted onto a single stem root system, and those will all bloom in the same time and are typically compatible with each other as well. So if you only wanted to plant one tree, that could be an option for you as well. Right now, we're going to be talking about dormant, when your trees are dormant, late winter to bloom. And as I said, we're in full bloom here in Eastern Kentucky right now. The stages that we're going to be talking about specifically are dormant, silver tip, green tip, half-inch green, tight cluster, pink, and bloom. This illustration right here is from a Cornell publication that came out in the 70s, Growth Stages in Fruit Trees from Dormant to Fruit Set. The link is available on the slide there. This is specifically apples. They also have stone fruit in there as well, other trees as well. So this is a nice publication as well. But dormant, you can see the tree just looks like a dormant twig. At silver tip, the bud has just started to break and you just see a little bit of silver fuzz at the tip. Green tip, it has expanded more. You're seeing a little bit of green tissue showing. Half-inch green is just what it sounds like. There's just a little bit of green at the tip of the buds. Tight cluster, all the bloom is in a tight cluster. Pink, the blooms are showing pink, and then full bloom is as you would expect. So it just progresses naturally along that process. Different treatments are needed to be applied to trees at different times. And we don't like to use calendars. We like to use the developmental stage, because if we told you a certain date on a calendar to apply sprays or something like that, depending upon the weather conditions, you might be too early, you might be too late. And we want people to follow an integrated pest management strategy so that you're doing things that are environmentally responsible, economically responsible as well. You're not applying chemicals that aren't going to be effective, or also economical of your time. You don't want to be doing activities. You don't always have to be doing chemical things to treat some of these things. In certain cases, there are cultural activities that can be done. I do have a list of resources on the final slide that provide a lot of good information about calendars, particularly for backyard growers. Fertilizing, I talked about this briefly. Don't guess soil test is our little catchphrase. If you call me up and ask me how much fertilizer you put down, or you call your county agent, they're going to say how much fertilizer is in your soil. And if you don't have a current soil test, we can't make recommendations for you. Kentucky, we're blessed. We have a soils lab in Lexington affiliated with the university that does soil testing. Unfortunately, our lab in Western Kentucky was destroyed in the tornado that hit. They're looking at getting all that back together, but it takes time to recover from something like that. So get your soil tested as early as you can, because as I said, everything has to run through Lexington now. Once you've got the pH and fertility pretty much established in an acceptable range, only supplemental nitrogen is typically required for then. And again, I don't like to see people fertilizing any of their fruit crops after the 4th of July. That's kind of my target window. As I get older, I use calendar dates, holidays, things to remember this. You can fertilize most of our fruit crops up until 4th of July, and they'll still have time to harden off before winter. Much beyond 4th of July, you could be encouraging growth that could be slow to harden off in times of winter. There are resistant varieties out there, so that is the first thing to be thinking about to minimize the sprays that are required for your fruit trees, your apple trees. Check with your nursery to see what these things are. This is available in one of the publications that I will be talking about. Some of the apples, these are our main diseases that apple trees are susceptible to: apple scab, cedar apple rust, fire blight, and powdery mildew. Their time of harvest and the varieties and things. Most of these that are listed here are highly resistant to apple scab. That's not true of all of our apple varieties. Unfortunately, a lot of our older flowering crabapple varieties are fairly susceptible to apple scab. Cedar apple rust is a very important disease in Kentucky, as is fire blight. Powdery mildew isn't quite as important as the other diseases. That's a later season disease as well, and I'm not going to be talking about that one as all. But there are varieties that are out there, so if you haven't planted yet, look at selecting varieties that are disease resistant. In terms of our major apple diseases that we have to think about early season from dormant to bloom, there's 3 that we need to think about. Fire blight is a bacterial disease, cedar apple rust, and apple scab. All of these are very characteristic looking, so they're pretty easy to diagnose. Hopefully you won't be seeing any of these, but if you're not spraying or anything, you will most likely be seeing these diseases. Apple scab overwinters on infected leaves that have fallen to the ground. So one of the most important things you can do is sanitation. As those leaves fall off the tree in the fall, go through with your mower, chop those leaves up. In commercial orchards, they'll often go through with a light application of nitrogen to help those leaves break down rather than mowing. But as those leaves decay, the tissue isn't present for the apple scab fungus to overwinter on, and it's no longer present. The apple scab doesn't overwinter up in the trees, it overwinters in the leaf tissue on the ground. What happens in the spring is we get primary infection. The spores released from any of the leaves that are on the ground go up into the tree, infect the new leaves, and then we get secondary infection from those leaves up in the tree. So if you control that primary infection on the leaves on the ground, you're going to be limited to any infection that's blowing in from surrounding apple trees and things to your apple tree. So sanitation is critical. If you do good sanitation and you have a resistant variety, that's going to be a great way to help manage apple scab. Primary infection time is from pink through bloom. Most of the spores for this have already been released within 2 weeks after petal fall. Secondary infection then will occur anytime when conditions are favorable. But the disease does affect the fruit as well as the leaves, can cause severe defoliation, really impacting the health of the trees. Fire blight is a bacterial disease, again, very characteristic. The name describes what it looks like. Looks like somebody's gone through the orchard with a blowtorch and just scorched the leaves. You see the leaves turn brown. At the figure on the bottom of the slide, you'll see what we call a shepherd's crook. That's kind of a hook at the tip of the branch. That's characteristic as well. They've peeled back the bark. In the figure next to that, you see dark staining in the wood underneath. So you can see that the infection proceeds deep into the wood in the tree. You get the cankers as well on the stem. So this is a very serious disease as well. It's one of the most destructive apples. It is a bacterial disease, so fungicides do not control this at all. Coppers will help to control this commercially. Some orchards will use streptomycin to control this, but we don't like to see routine spraying of antibiotics around. That just leads to the development of super bacteria that are resistant to things. The bacteria do multiply rapidly when conditions are appropriate, over 65 degrees. Bees do move these from flower to flower. I will mention that I am a beekeeper as well. Pollination is critical. You never spray insecticides during bloom. We need to protect our pollinators. People say, should we move beehives into our orchards to help pollinate the apple trees and things? I always like to see more beehives around, but actually honeybees are not one of the primary pollinators of apple trees. It's actually mason bees and orchard bees are more of our pollinators that pollinate apple trees and things. We encourage people to, again, to use an integrated management strategy, minimize tree susceptibility by avoiding excess nitrogen fertilizer. Again, that young succulent growth is going to be very prone to infection by the bacteria. Reduce the amount of bacteria in the orchard. You can do that by pruning in late winter. If you see those cankers on the tree, you go in and you need to prune those back 8 to 12 inches or so below the canker, because as it showed in that one figure, you can get infection proceeding lower in the tree below the canker and things. So you need to make sure that you cut back deep enough to get that out as well. Controlling insects that have piercing and sucking mouth parts as well, aphids, leafhoppers, parasilla, that can spread the bacteria from tree to tree. So that also includes weed management in your orchard, because these insects can often be found not only on your apple trees, but also on weeds underneath your tree. So the insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts can transmit these bacteria from tree to tree as well. There are varieties out there that were shown on the earlier slide that do have some fire blight resistance. That's through the rootstock primarily. Trees that get fire blight infections in their roots will typically die. There is some scion resistance, which is the top portion of the tree that has a little bit of resistance, but primarily most of the resistance to fire blight in apple trees is the resistance in the rootstock itself. Cedar apple rust is the third disease. I've heard spores can travel a half mile. That's not hard to believe at all. I have heard up to a mile even. I'd have to ask our fruit pathologist, Dr. Nicole Gauthier, what she thinks about that as well. Perhaps she might be interested in presenting on one of these horticulture webinars, Wednesday webinars, if there's more interest specifically in some of these diseases as well. She is our pathologist and can address these specific apple diseases in much more depth than I can do here in this short time. It is a fungal disease found east of the Rockies. West of the Rockies, they haven't had to deal with it. They also typically in the commercial areas in Washington and that where they grow apples, their humidity is lower, so they don't have as many disease issues to fight as we do. It can defoliate trees and blemish fruit, making them unmarketable. I don't know of any place in Kentucky really that you can get half a mile or more from a cedar tree. That's just an endemic tree in Kentucky. So again, you have the susceptible host that carries it. It does require, the disease does require two hosts. It requires an apple tree. It doesn't have to be a Malus domestica. It could be the flowering crab apple or a hawthorn as well. And then the eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, to complete its life cycle. What happens is the spores that are released from the apple tree transmit and infect the cedar tree. And then the ones that are on the cedar tree will release in the spring, go back and infect the apple tree. So it does require those two hosts, but again, trying to eliminate all cedar trees within a mile of your apple trees, and that would be a futile attempt probably. This is what the eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, does look like. If you're not familiar with the tree, very common along interstates and things. And this is a illustration that I borrowed from Growing Better Gardener's website, just because it does illustrate very well that disease life cycle, and it's very characteristic. Starting in the upper left, if it was spring on a juniper tree, you would see these orange horn-like structures on the cedar tree. That's the fungal fruiting body. When conditions are appropriate, those spores are released, and then the wind and rain transmit the spores over to the apple leaf. You then get infection of the apple leaf, development of the lesions, then those are released, and then they will blow back to the juniper tree in late summer. Then the spores will germinate in the juniper, form these galls, and then again back to the fruiting structure. So it's not a one-time and you've got it under control. It's a 2-year cycle, so you need to make the treatments 3 years in a row to see any results at all, really. Once the disease is present around, it's difficult to control it. But again, there are some varieties that do have some resistance to cedar apple rust. And again, if you have a lot of cedar trees around, certainly reducing the amount of inoculum that's present in your environment will help that. There are chemicals that can be used for controlling some of these diseases. Early sprays are the most important for your disease control because our fungicides and that do not, for the general rule, have much systemic activity. You need to get good coverage. It only protects the foliage on the tree and that. So that's why it needs to be reapplied after rains and things to protect that foliage. And it doesn't transmit from one leaf to another as a general rule. There is one chemical I will talk about here, Immunox. That does have a little bit of systemic activity and will transmit a little bit through the tree. But as a general rule, our fungicides are strictly protectants. Always make sure you wear your personal protective equipment that's listed on the label. Typically, you want to wait 12 hours before going back in and doing anything else, at least until your trees are dry. Home orchards are exempt from worker protection standards, but again, you just use common sense, and no point in going in and doing something right away if you don't need to. But that Immunox is excellent for apple scab control. It's excellent for controlling rust and powdery mildews as well. Because it is a fungicide, though, it won't control fire blight. We do have two major insect apple pests that I'll talk about. San Jose scale. It's a very small insect. It spends most of its life as a little insect that's protected itself with a waxy type covering on the tree. So you really only get one shot for controlling it when it's moving from one location on a tree after the eggs hatch to a new location to cover it. Because if it's covered up with that waxy covering, your pesticides are not going to have any effect on it. There is a fact sheet that's available on the entomology website that's listed here for that. Action is taken based upon growing degree days. Again, phenology is the study of seasonal natural phenomenon as it relates to climate and plant and animal life. And that we try to encourage people to look at growing degree days for when certain pesticide treatments need to be applied. In this case, at about 380 growing degrees, when the Ohio buckeye tree blooms, that's when the crawlers, those young scale insects, emerge from the eggs and are starting to move around on the tree. At 600 to 700 growing degree days is when you have maximum crawler treatment, and that's the best time for an insecticide spray to controlling it. That's about the time that arrowwood viburnum is in full bloom. That UK weather site, weather.uky.edu, does have a growing degree calculator on it, so you can check that out. If you're not in Kentucky, you can probably contact your local agent in whatever state you're in, and they can help you find growing degree days in your own location as well. But again, pretty easy to control them if it's timed properly. If it's not timed properly, you're not going to get any control at all. It doesn't take a very heavy infestation of San Jose scale to severely damage a tree. Our other major early apple insect is rosy apple aphid. Again, there's a fact sheet that's available from our entomology department. They have some excellent websites, fact sheets available for you as well. To get good control of this, you have to control it early in the season before the leaves curl up. What happens is these aphids will cause a leaf to curl, and then they're protected. You can't get good coverage of your insecticide on the leaf once that covered over. Check early, right around pink stage is when you'll monitor on the underside of the leaf for these apple aphids. The rosy apple aphids are very characteristic. They're just a nice light pink. You can see some nice pictures on that fact sheet as well. Stepping back a little bit into earlier in the season, before we're worried too much about insects and diseases, late winter, February into early March, pruning. I wanted to talk on that briefly. Pruning can be done then, should be done then. Make sure your pruners and saws are sharp. Make sure you don't leave branch stubs. This publication for Vermont University just illustrates that as well. You see the branch collar. You don't have to cut flush with the trunk of the tree. Just cut off your branches at that branch collar so that will heal off over. That's where your most actively growing cambial tissue is, and it will heal over quicker if you cut at that branch collar than if you cut directly along the stem there. There's a smaller surface area. And also, when you do make your cuts, if you have a large limb, follow a 3-cut process with the first cut on the underside of the branch, a second cut out towards the tip of the branch beyond that. If you don't make this first cut there, that branch can be heavy enough that it can actually snap that branch and tear down the trunk of the tree, and you have a larger wound. By making this first cut, it snaps there, and then you can just come in and cut off that small portion of stem between the second cut and the branch collar to allow the tree to heal over quicker. We don't typically recommend application of wound care dressings or painting those anymore. That's changed over times. Typically, we find that they heal over just as quick without that. There are times that we do like to paint trees down near the soil surface if it's a tree variety that's prone to frost cracking. What happens in the spring, particularly on the west and south sides, southwest side of the tree, you'll get the sunlight reflecting off of snow, heating up the bark, and then in the evening when the sun goes down, it cools quickly and you can get some frost cracking. So we will occasionally recommend things. Some varieties of apples are more prone to that. Pawpaw trees are also very susceptible to that as well. So we will still recommend painting, but not necessarily as a wound care treatment. This is a simplified planting scheme for backyard apple plantings. Tells you what needs to be done and when. At dormant, before the bud swell, you can treat for fire blight with fixed copper. You can treat for scale with dormant oil. Make sure that dormant oil, if you're going to be applying that, temperature should be above 24 degrees for 24 hours. If you have scale insect problems, that's when you need to be looking at. Again, don't spray if you don't have dormant oil, if you don't have scale problems, but if you do, dormant oil is pretty effective at controlling it. Green tip to half-inch green, you'll be controlling for fire blight. You can also use dormant oil then. Scale, again, if you didn't use it as a dormant, you could wait on the dormant oil application at dormant, later in the season, depending on what you want to do. One thing I need to highlight here, some insecticides, fungicides, some chemicals can be applied to minimize the amount of labor that you're doing. Do not ever mix Captan, which is a very common fungicide. It's used for controlling scab. Don't mix Captan and oil combined because you'll get some burning of your trees and things if you do that. It's pink, you're going to be controlling for cedar apple rust. Captan, again, is very useful. Malathion is good for controlling aphids, stink bugs, tarnished plant bug, which has that piercing, sucking mouth part that can spread to fire blight disease. At bloom, no insecticides at bloom because we're protecting our pollinators. Streptomycin, don't really recommend that. That could be an option, but we don't really recommend it unless you have a large backyard orchard. So Immunox, again, at bloom, it is systemic, won't wash off. It's very good if you can combine that with Captan to help slow the development of resistance. Here's some links that I'll leave up. Our plant pathology department, I talked about Dr. Gauthier, Kim Leonberger, and others have really worked hard on producing videos, fact sheets, just a lot of information that's out there. That one chart that I showed came from the Simplified Backyard Apple and Spray Guide. We have those for other fruits as well. So go to that plant pathology website. You'll find a lot of very useful information there. We do have a backyard apple and pear disease, pest, and cultural practice calendar that tells you what to do and when. That's really geared for season-long things, focusing on different insects and things. Again, the plant pathology website in general has a very good publication. MW stands for Midwest, the Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide. Publication 591 is the number on that. It's available as a PDF. You can print it off or just bookmark it on your calendar. I think it's about 40 some pages or something like that. Excellent publication out there. We do have an IPM website for integrated pest management at the College of Agriculture that specifically, and this website doesn't specifically focus on apples, it focuses on IPM, but there is a section that is just for apples as well. And in my department in horticulture, we have a document list that has a lot of information on home fruit publications as well. Commercially, if you do run into issues and things, your agent should have available this Midwest Home Fruit Pest Management Guide. We update this pretty much every year. It's now up to 290 pages, not really geared for the home gardener. There is good information in there that they can look up and find more information for you if you need. It's really geared for our commercial growers. But there's a lot of information out there. I encourage you to check out the Horticulture Webinar Wednesday YouTube channel. There's just tremendous amounts of information out there. I can't begin to focus on all of this in this publication. But again, contact your county agents. I'll be happy to try and address any questions that you have now. If they can't help you out, I'll be happy to work with them and see if we can address your issues as well. But again, you can grow good apples, you can produce good quality fruit. Does require a little bit of work. It's not simply just put an apple tree in the ground and forget about it. But the advantage to this is you know how they've been treated. You can grow varieties that are you specifically like. I would encourage you to look at varieties that are resistant. There are some that are actually immune to apple scab. There's a difference between immunity and resistance. Things that are immune won't get the disease. Things that are resistant still will get the disease, just not as bad as things that aren't resistant.